So welcome everybody to this week's installation of Global Peoria, where we look at global events and how they affect us locally. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Sam Kessler. This is a back by popular demand kind of invitation. Sam spoke with us last year on a similar topic, but this one's a little more broad and a little more nuanced. Sam is a writer, analyst, and consultant who writes on global security, geopolitics, and business finance fused topics and projects for clients, businesses, and publications. In addition, he also contributes to Asian Affairs Magazine, Overture Global, NASE, Fulcrum Global, as well as on his own professional website at www.samkessler.com. He's also a geopolitical advisor for the North Star Support Group and contributes analytical articles for them bi-monthly. He has a master's in national security studies with a concentration in security and intelligence analysis from American Military University, part of the American Public University system. He has an undergraduate degree in international studies with a minor in economics from Bradley University, and he is an intelligence analyst. He has an intelligence analyst certificate from the Analyst Boot Camp at the Advanced Technical Intelligence Center for Human Capital Development, which is now part of the Wright State Research Institute. He's also currently president of the Society for Defense and Strategic Studies at American Military University, and he is the founding member and chief managing editor of Fulcrum Global, the publishing arm of the Society for Defense and Strategic Studies at AMU. So welcome back, Sam. Are you making it work?
You know what? I just I'm trying to figure out. I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure where do you add the document?
Share the screen. At the bottom of your face, you should have like a green button that says share screen. If you have your PowerPoint open, so once you click on share screen, it'll show you what's open. You just click on the document you want to share.
Okay. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. We are all set now. All right.
Excellent.
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, it looks really good.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm gonna be perfectly honest. I just put it together today, and I did a little cheat sheet today because I looked at what I put together for you guys last year, and I used some elements of it, like the design, and maybe a slide or two might look a little familiar, but I modified a lot of it, so it's not all the same from last year.
Excellent.
So, well, first of all, thanks, Angela. I want to really thank you for that and the opportunity to do another presentation on this, because it's what I presented last year on U.S. and China still very relevant, and there's always been a Russia element to it, so the whole Russia aspect is nothing new. But you know, you're hearing a lot in the media that, you know, Russia this, Russia that, but I think, you know, you don't get a lot of the big picture in, you know, a lot of the media, and really in many ways you have to go to specialized sources, you know, like, you know, geopolitical groups like, you know, whether it's Stratfor or Geopolitical Futures, to get some different perspectives as to what's going on, or in other circles too. But, you know, the topic of this presentation is going to just look at US, China, Russia triangle, and that's what was established back in the 70s with Nixon, Kissinger, and Mao. We're going to look at a little bit of the current status, a little past, not too much of it, and look at possible scenarios of what's going on. And I really look forward to a Q&A. And so I'm going to try to not be as too in-depth, but I have a habit of doing that. So I'm going to try to limit that to some extent. But a lot of the material is going to be very relevant, and it will continue to be so for a good while. But it's all about perspective and adding extra content and adding on to it. But let's get started. Angela mentioned my background. I'm not going to get too much into that, but what I will mention is I feel like I'm always referring to my master thesis every so often because it's that relevant. And I'm someone who looks at a lot of trends and indicators, and looking at the China-Russia relations after Crimea, and then examining the path to a possible alliance and the threat to US soft power management. These are issues that have been going on for a very long time. And I'm going to cover some aspects of that. It's not going to be very related to my thesis because that's from 4 years ago, but very realistic, very significant though, in some of the work I do. Professional background, you kind of covered all of that. I will just mention Fulcrum Global is like the publishing arm or a digital media. It's now evolved into more of a digital media platform because we do writing and resources and podcasts now that relate to defense, intelligence, foreign affairs, and national security folks. And so it's we basically combine academia and the professional world. And we have people who are either just, who are entering the workforce into it, or they're already in it. And the one thing about the industry is people are always going back to school. So it's best to have a nice blend of professional and academia, because that's the type of industry it is. Everyone's always continuing to learning to upgrade skill sets. Let's get started here. So this is very similar to what this particular slide is similar to what I had on the opening of the presentation I gave you last year, because the content is, I still think it's very relevant. We're in a period where the international system, the rules-based order, is evolving from the post-World War II era and the post-Cold War era. You have a system that has been very workable and very relevant, but the problem is you're seeing a lot of new players, centralized and decentralized players, and we're in a period where great power politics or competition is back, but we're in an era where people are kind of relearning what that means. Because it's been, you've had a certain way of doing things, a certain way of learning how to operate in a system. And there's a lot of emphasis on updating mindsets and awareness, and to go from a linear approach to a nonlinear mindset in many ways. And that's still evolving. We're seeing more states and non-state entities with muscle and power projection capabilities. We've been seeing that for several years. And it all ties in with soft, hard, or smart power. If you have any questions about that, I'll be happy to go into more detail about that. But we're seeing a lot of that more, and it's been going on for about 15 years. In fact, I remember around 2008, there was a meeting, I think it was like a Senate intelligence meeting on what they thought, the next 10, 15 years was going to be about. And they were saying it's going to be greater competition, and greater competition in terms of arms races, business, technology, all of that. And this was around 2008, 2009. And I mean, a lot of people have been seeing this, but seeing it and not acting or preparing for it are two different things. A lot of times, you live in the moment. There's a very big difference. What can happen 10 years from now versus the current. And, we've spent 2 decades of what would be considered as small wars, and they're manageable. And we're looking at getting out of theaters of war in the Middle East and in Central Asia. Whether that happens or not, we'll find out. Some friends and I, we have questions whether we're really going to leave Afghanistan, because there's a lot of reasons behind that. And you have the whole issue with the Middle East, which is really interesting. And there is a US, China, Russia relationship to all of that as well. And there's other powers involved, but there's a major rebalancing. So there's a lot of areas to look at, especially in the South China Sea. You're seeing a lot of changes happening there, as well as, in the Black Sea or in areas of Eastern Europe. So we're in very difficult times right now, or I would say interesting times. Famous quote. But in this era, in this period, it's realism is very much back because we're dealing with realist players. But what does that mean for people in Western society, or in a society like in the country in the US or elsewhere? What does that mean, and how do we go about that? And a lot of people are saying we're in a Cold War period, but there's elements of the Cold War, but it's not the same thing, because the Cold War was based on a different approach, and we're dealing with an opposite. We're dealing with a totalitarian government when we're talking about competition, but they're not putting all their emphasis on the military. They have been, but you also have to realize, they're if you look at the Chinese and Russian military expenditures, if you combined it, it's very close, or I think it might be a slightly more than what the US spends. And that is a big issue that's being discussed in Washington over budget issues, and just basically what, in terms of how much should go to, to updating the Navy or Army. And there's a lot of issues like that, especially with supply and supply chains and logistic issues that are really getting more significant in terms of focus. But we're in this period, and whether you're a state or non-state entity, everyone has a stake in it. And this has been evolving, but we've started really addressing it back around 2017, when policy doctrine started being updated. National security strategy, defense, intelligence and counterintelligence strategies, cyber strategy, space, economic and foreign policies. And that brings up the grand strategy issue, which I'm not going to bring up unless if someone wants to talk about that some more. But we're dealing with a lot of that stuff that we finally started tackling it in 2017. But you have COVID, and you have more heightened tensions, and you also have domestic events happening here that could really jeopardize what we want to try to do, in terms of our power projection abroad. And you have a lot of things. You have supply chain issues that have limited, that have compromised, like from defense to commercial sectors, and it's very serious. But I want to get forward with I want to start with the past when it comes to the US-China-Russia relationship. And this is somewhat similar to what I had in the presentation last year, but you have the Cold War in the 70s. You have Nixon, Kissinger. They decided to make an agreement with Mao to basically be more aligned with the US during the Cold War. And this helped with not having to worry about China in case they ever decided to realign with China, because at one point they were, but they had border disputes and they had a falling out. So it kept it kept China on the side of the U.S. And that became what was known as the U.S., China, Russia triangle balance of power system. And it enabled the U.S. to really take advantage of the Soviet Union's economic emphasis on the military rather than focusing on building up their society of sorts. And that led to what was a quiet disintegration of the Soviet Union. So after the Cold War, Chinese and Russian relations began to improve. They started small, but during the Yeltsin administration, they started with a few small agreements. And one thing that is important to notice about how they make agreements and partnerships, they go through various rounds where they upgrade it over time. And when they do, it's usually at the same time, like, it correlates with another agreement. And so they go through different rounds over a series of years since probably the mid 90s, maybe early 90s. But you have to look at it from that angle that, they've been improving their relations, and they're also doing more to work together from a military, from a cyber. They still have a lot of trust issues. That's the interesting thing, because everything in the, whether you're in foreign policy or national security, everyone wants to say, well, they don't trust each other very well. But in a period where they have aligned interests and perceived adversaries, that's very likely they could find a way to just work together. And whether that is lasting, that's, who knows if that would be possible. I don't think it would, but that's different. But to get back, you have China. Some key points I put here. You have, China joins the WTO and they become the powerhouse they've become now in terms of manufacturing. And they started realizing that if they wanted to become a stronger power, they had to upgrade some of their policies in terms of, from a military perspective. But we have been seeing for the last several years a series of increased expansionist policies, or what is also known as salami slicing tactics, where they take a little bit here, take a little bit there, and it's over time it adds up. And that's been very well documented for the past decade, and especially in Southeast Asia. But in terms of what we see with the Belt and Road Initiative, that is another policy that is part of their expansion, because they're tying everything from an economic and infrastructure perspective, but the deals have been not very friendly to the recipients. So it actually puts it in short, it puts, if you go into the Belt and Road Initiative program, it's going to be very beneficial for the PRC in terms of control, but also being able to use it for other purposes. And people in the defense and national security sectors have been looking at that aspect. And I have a friend who has been focusing very heavily on the Belt and Road Initiative, who, we started connecting the dots in Central Asia with Afghanistan, and how if the US does leave Afghanistan, what are the benefits to the Belt and Road Initiative? And a lot of it ties into land and sea routes as well as air routes to access things, resources like energy from the Middle East, which ties into the partnership with Iran. So there's a lot of different ways to look at what's going on with the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'll be happy to go a little bit more detail about that. But to continue, there's a Russia element. To look at how Russia has evolved, it's very general, and if you have any additions, I'll be happy to hear that. But I wanted to note, you have the 90s that were very turbulent for Russia at that time period. You had basically what Paul Klebnikov, a Forbes journalist who was murdered for his coverage of the period. He coined it as gangster capitalism. So it was very turbulent, lots of corruption, and it all stemmed through the process when they were trying to privatize all the state national resources. So you look at from that angle, and Klebnikov's book, Godfather of the Kremlin, is actually a good read if you're interested in that type of thing, to understand how Vladimir Putin came to power, because the book is about Boris Berezovsky, and he's the one who brought in Putin and ended up becoming a major enemy of Putin. And that's another story. But Putin comes to power, and one of the things he does, he starts the process of reorganizing the military and improving it. And you see at least, 4 key theaters of war where, he starts to bring the Russia military involvement: Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, and Syria. And there's a lot of, as you know, issues surrounding those areas. But in terms of tactics, I forgot to bring up China with 3 warfares and unrestricted warfare policies, but that ties in with Russia's hybrid warfare doctrine. It's the way how they respond to dealing with a larger military that is stronger. So they're not going to deal with warfare from a conventional or from a kinetic approach. And so they look at it from an asymmetrical, where you're looking at other ways to go about it, whether it's economics, business, law, or fused capabilities, rather than depending on conventional warfare. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into it, but one thing when it comes to, people talk about kinetic warfare, and it's the thing people are worried about, but people hardly ever talk about what really leads up to it, and that's the non-kinetic aspect, and that's been going on for a very long time, in various forms. Everything adds up, so that's where diplomacy is going to be very essential. But here I'm going to now provide a description of those types of forms, because it's very relevant in this period. Unrestricted warfare, it was actually right around the time period when they were entering the WTO. They saw how Chinese colonels who PRC colonels in the PLA who saw American success with a lot of different forms of warfare, whether it was information-based, electronic, signals intelligence, and they realized they needed to find another doctrine if they wanted to defeat a technologically superior adversary through alternative methods rather than with military confrontation. And that's where I'm talking about with non-kinetic, non-linear methods. I mean, these are old, this is nothing new. It's been around, but you have to look at how this impacts things like, diplomacy, crime, business, economics, legal, media, cyber, terrorism, all that stuff. It's all interrelated in many ways. And there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of ways to look at, there's a lot of examples that's out there that discuss in depth, what can be classified, because you can utilize a lot of proxy elements to make it possible. But one aspect is that also came out of the early 2000s, three warfare strategy. And it basically is about winning wars, achieving national objectives with little or no fighting at all. And that can be done psychologically or public opinion warfare or legal warfare. And we've seen that all over in the world of business and soft power. And the Belt and Road Initiative is utilized in that way when you look at the type of deals that come out of it. One example is like Pakistan, where there's a province called Balochistan, and you have a port that they've been developing called Gwadar, and the way that the agreement is set up really benefits the PRC holding company more so than the local government and the people in that area. And it's one of those things where, you know, countries are going to give up some of their crown jewels because they think they're going to get benefits, and there in some ways there are benefits to that. But you know, it really depends on long term, you know, from that perspective. And a lot of countries are in a lot of different scenarios where, you know, they're in situations that, you know, they really have no choice, or they don't have many options. So that's the thing. So these are some aspects that you see from there, but Russia has their own approach, which is hybrid warfare. And that's something I've studied a lot over the years. But I'm actually using source from the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, because they had a really great article. Because I thought one guy was actually the father of it, but it turned out it was a foreign policy minister who was very famous at the time, Yevgeny Primakov. So hybrid warfare is the policy that stemmed out as a foreign policy approach, but also stemmed from a operations perspective. And it was established for essentially as a way to readapt the Russian state in the system. And, you know, they had to come to the realization that they had limitations in terms of power projection, military, economy, all of that. So it was developed by Yevgeny Primakov and further developed by Valery Gerasimov, who's a colonel in the Russian military. The approach is very polymathic, nonlinear, and is all about fusion. It fuses existing assets and capabilities for different purposes. And it's been around for a good while, but we really started paying more attention to that approach by the Russian military in 2014 in Georgia. I mean, we saw in 2008 in what happened in Georgia, but we started paying more attention to it in Ukraine and what happened in Crimea. And then we saw the same approach in Syria. And what it really does is, the quote from the article, they called it whole of government concept that fuses hard and soft power across many domains and transcends boundaries between peace and wartime. So you're kind of combining everything. And it's an effort to develop an operational concept for Russian foreign policy. And it's meant to be developed from an operational aspect, you know, with the idea that they're going to still be in confrontation with the West at the time. So this has been going on for over 2 decades, and we're just now, for the last 7 or 8 years, we've been noticing more about their tactics. And it's really about risk management. It's about risk management, but it's about taking risks. And they realize that hard power is too risky, it's costly, it's impractical, but military power is always in the background. So they're using a lot of different areas. It could tie in with cyber warfare. It could tie in with information operations. It could tie in with psyops or psychology operations. And then they tie elements of military to it. But the whole idea is not to rely too heavily on military because they don't have those capabilities. But they've managed to handle that fairly well these last several years. In terms of principles, some aspects that hybrid warfare is about for the Russians is to strive for a multipolar world, because they want to still be able to counterbalance the U.S. And that is a policy, and the system is heading into a multipolar world in terms of power projection, and you're seeing more players out there. It's the same sentiments that we've been seeing for a very long while, but the Russians still want to keep their sphere of influence. It's for a variety of reasons, for historical reasons, but also for defense reasons, because the Russians, even though they may not perceive a threat to their sphere of influence in terms of being attacked, they still want to have keep building up that nice bubble or that nice cushion, so that they have better response times. I mean, it's kind of like what you saw during World War II and previous times, where they were able to respond better because they have such large landmass. But this is hybrid warfare. It's been around, and from a military perspective, we handle the U.S. handles elements of this as well. So it really is an interesting concept. The problem, the issues with the U.S. is everyone is relearning how to deal with limited resources and supply chain issues. That's a real big issue, and it's really evolving as to what needs to be done and look at areas of manufacturing. So, lastly, we still have tensions with China and Russia, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. They're all related, and there's a lot of situations going on that are impacting how decisions are being made. I mean, one thing that was brought up is we're sending missile defense systems out of Middle East and to some unknown place, but with what's going on in Taiwan or in the Black Sea, they could be moved elsewhere, whether it's Europe or Asia. I have no idea, but there's a lot of interesting situations going on. Greater awareness by allies and everyone, like in Southeast Asia, you have the Quad, who is like US, Canada, US, Australia, India, and I want to say the UK too. but I'd have to go back. But there's a lot of people, whether it's in NATO or in Southeast Asia, who are more concerned as we continue to progress. And, we're going to continue seeing these tactics being utilized. More people are aware, but people are there's people who are not paying attention to it, or they just are still understanding the importance and how it impacts their lives. In the end, I really think it's still very likely that if the U.S. doesn't utilize the opportunities that can be presented, it's very likely to have a Chinese-Russian strategic alliance to counter the U.S. And I think that's very realistic now more than ever. I think I'll stop there, but I'll be happy to answer any questions, and I hope this was helpful.
It was. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, remember, you are welcome to type your questions in the chat. We've got a small enough group as well, so if you're very interested, you can unmute yourself and ask. I would like to ask the first one. On your last slide, you mentioned the multi-vector opportunities. What kinds of things can the United States, well, first let me ask this. Do you think that a true alliance between Russia and China is likely or even possible?
Well, I think they've been developing that. I think it's likely because they've been upgrading their capabilities in terms of partnerships with military and even cyber. I mean, they have issues. I mean, I think I think at this point you have to look at, if they have a common goal, the enemy of my enemy is, my friend. But then they also have to consider the reality is, well, say you take that enemy, what happens afterwards? I don't see it lasting very long after that. I mean, it all sounds like The Godfather when you think about it. I mean, it's the same stuff. And I saw The Godfather Part 3 a few days ago, and I thought a really good quote that came out of it was, "Our enemies get stronger on our crumbs." And I think in many ways we're seeing a similar situation like that.
That's interesting. I was thinking in terms of a marriage of convenience with a very strong prenuptial agreement.
Yes. That is, I think, very realistic. But I mean, from a multi-vector perspective, if the issue with that is, I wrote a piece on that when Trump went to Finland, and I was actually, because I'm working on a piece now, and I'm thinking, well, do I really want to say that? Because it kind of looks like it's leaning this way, but there's still opportunities, and people weigh a lot of value of what the recent meetings between Biden and Putin, and I think there are a lot of interesting things that came out of it, or a lot of things we learned about in terms of you're trying to. I think giving Nord Stream it doesn't make sense to a lot of people, but I'm wondering, well, did he see this as a way to try to wean him off of China? But was that really effective? I really don't think so. I mean, I think you have to really go all in on it, and he has to, be willing to do that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, in this system, you have people who want to go back to the way it was, and I really don't think it's that realistic. I mean, I think it's an attempt to try to cool things off, but you have a lot of other stuff. I mean, the strategy, you have what's going on in the Black Sea with the Ukraine, or even with countries like, they have a heavy influence in Belarusia, but you have other countries like Lithuania, Poland, Estonia, who are aching to become parts of NATO. And I think, there's a lot of plays related to that aspect too, I think, where, they're trying to, put a little, pressure here, but a little benefit here. And I was actually listening to a podcast, and I thought it was an interesting point the guy made is, was in 2014 after Crimea, the Putin and Obama administrations came to an agreement where he would not go past east of the territories he had annexed, and the U.S. would not put forth much, I'm trying to remember if he said any.
We weren't going to arm the Ukrainians with the latest technology. Yeah.
Right. And, that's why I was bringing up, because there's the missile defense systems all over the Middle East are being moved somewhere. So could it be for Ukraine, or could it be for Taiwan? Who knows? I mean, there's a lot of interesting ways to look at that stuff. And so I'm not going to look at it all from a black and white. I know people have criticisms. I know my perspectives, but I also know that there's a lot more going on than we can speculate as much as possible. But there's a lot more.
Well, I want to get to Larry and Janet's question by prefacing it with another expert that I listen to as well, that one of the greatest dangers that the United States faces is our own willingness to assume that Russia is a diminished power and that China is still up and coming. It's an economic power, but not a military power. As you pointed out earlier, China is a military power, and Russia is a military power. That same expert noted that Russia is more willing to test its new military weaponry on the battlefield of Syria because, nobody's objecting to that. So the United States can't be caught not paying attention. Janet and Larry ask, do Russia and China share technology? Are they sharing their advancements with each other to improve their capacities?
Yeah, there have been exchanges of that. There have also been, from what I understand, there's been amicable exchanges, but there's also been not so amicable ones. And so, I mean, there have been, I mean, because it's, the situation between China and Russia, there's still the trust issue, because, I think Putin knows that, if they're not careful, he could easily lose his power or sphere of influence if they decide to strengthen their positions with Belt and Road initiatives in the Eurasia, or, and also technology. And so, but they have to work together. But yeah, there are definitely partnerships where they are exchanging technology, and I know missile systems have been utilized. I can't think of the name off the bat, like SF-400 or
something like that. Yeah. So another question is, again, the marriage of convenience between Russia and China. They have a common goal of pushing back against the United States. They have a common goal of promoting their own interests in their sphere and globally. What happens when those interests clash? You mentioned, for example, that China's look at the US withdrawal of Afghanistan may present a unique opportunity for them to expand the Belt and Road Initiative through Afghanistan to the oil fields of Iran. And so they wouldn't have to be as tightly tied to Russia as they are now for gas and oil reserves, because they could get them elsewhere. So if they aren't helping each other out in some ways, does that make their potential marriage of convenience less likely or more likely? And how can we encourage that to be a rocky marriage?
Well, one of I think one of the things we're dealing with going forward is a series of resource wars. I mean, really, I mean, and actually, Buddy and I, for the Fulcrum Global podcast, we actually talked about Afghanistan. And one of the key points that, we actually don't think where the U.S. is actually going to leave Afghanistan or at least still have a presence. And there's a lot of mineral resources, and in terms of technology, there's a lot of important resources in that region that could really, in many ways, bring the country up economically. So that's one element. I mean, Taiwan is another issue because they're practically the semiconductor electronics, powerhouse of the region. So, and that, if Taiwan goes, the U.S. from a technology perspective would be very, in bad shape from that perspective.
Yeah.
But, well, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again?
What can the United States do to make any potential alliance or future strategies that are mutually beneficial to Russia and China? What can we do to make them less likely? And I think you just pointed out a couple of them. Make sure that Taiwan does not fall. Defend Taiwan so that the global, semiconductor world is safe. Earlier you mentioned Ukraine, not letting Russia seize any more territory than they already have, and perhaps pushing them back if possible. But certainly supporting our NATO allies in Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. So I think you've answered the question. I think you did okay. We've got a couple in the chat. Alan's is, maybe you can think about this for the last one. Where do you get your information? What are your best sources of information for the rest of the crowd if they want to keep up on this topic? So answer that one last. And Beatrice asks, have the European allies compromised to actively participate and create a plan to put China in line after the current administration meeting? Or is it a dream only, according to what she heard?
Well, I think with the NATO allies, I think they realize they need to adapt. They need to figure out new strategies. Everyone is hard pressed because there are major supply issues going on, and so it's impacting them, and it impacts how exactly are they going to look at revisualize their manufacturing basis. I mean, that we've been hearing for years about manufacturing this, manufacturing that, and then COVID is just the catalyst for seeing that really come to fruition in that sense. I think the Europeans it depends on which country it is. I think their politics is so complicated. It's not always, I'm not always fully certain as to how they're going to have an approach. I think for years I've looked at how 5G from a 5G perspective with Huawei and the efforts from the Trump administration to try to wing them off of it, because that affects the Five Eyes, and because if the technology is being used, they can't trust them. And I think we're seeing something along the lines with New Zealand, and so there's been some from an economic perspective, but also from a Five Eyes or five groups of intelligence. countries that share their intelligence and all that. Those are serious issues. I think with I'm still figuring out with what I think there is a growing need by the NATO allies to respond, but it's been fairly slow. It really depends on it always depends on leadership and the people involved. And the reality is we have a lot of people who have been doing things a certain way for a long time for whatever reason. And I mean, that's where the whole mindset issue is a real thing I keep observing. Because I don't think people, I mean, here's the irony is I've been saying things like great power competition or great power politics for years, and all of a sudden it's being used, and it's kind of weird. And it's not just it's weird, but I sometimes wonder, do these people really understand what it means? And
that's the latest buzzword.
yeah, and
it's not the latest buzzword, but for many it is.
Yeah, and so
I think is there an effort to, separately first for Russia's approach in Europe? You talked about the Nord Stream. So, in order to use the Nord Stream as a tool to try to force Russia to do something other than what they're doing, we'd have to have the European countries, especially Germany, for example, who gets a third of their gas from Russia, to be on board with not finishing the pipeline, not taking shipments from Russia.
Well,
that's pretty big ask of them.
Well, one thing I keep thinking is we've seen what Russia has done when they provide power or energy to countries, and then they don't like their policies or they change the government that's not friendly, they cut it off.
Right.
So I would look at, well, you have a strategy, a contingency plan, and if you're a European country like Germany or whoever, you probably should consider that. I mean, there's an analysis, there's something called red team analysis, and you have to look at a lot of possible threats. You have to look at from an adversary, and then you also have to look at, so how do you take it out without, how do you achieve this without having all these fancy gadgets? Kind of sounds like MacGyver, but it's interesting. But you kind of have to look at, well, you have other options to give them oil, but this is another one. I mean, the whole idea is to have as many options as possible, and you want to have access. And there's other ways where they could get access to oil if they needed as an emergency. And so my thinking is, well, that could, if they really wanted, they could, that could be shut down, because you're giving Russia a nice revenue stream, but you could always cut it off yourself if you really wanted to. And you have that angle, and that's leverage too. So the thing is, you also have to look at it's not based on being worried about what they do, but you also have to realize, well, what can we do so that we can have a nice response? Or at least, say if we don't like this, we have this option and we're going to cut you down. I mean, cut you off, not down. But so, I mean, you have to look at it from that angle. And another thing I would talk about, it's a Belt and Road Initiative thing. And it's actually a question. I did a presentation. It was for the Dayton World Affairs Council. And one of the people was asking, well, I mean, you have a country like Sri Lanka who just gave away their port for 99 years. I mean, how can you be, not too concerned? Well, my opinion is, well, I mean, maybe it says 99 years, but it can change. And the reason why you're seeing that in Australia, because Australia is a very interesting place to watch about how they're responding to China, because their media is kind of, it's interesting. I always have to be careful because, they're very slanted one way, but they have a lot of interesting things to say at the same time. But the way they're responding is in terms of ports and strategic port areas, they're actually trying to reverse some of those contracts that were really bad contracts that were made like 5-6 years ago. And it sounds like it's going to happen. And so I think that's the nature of the system is, people are, I don't know what that leads to, because you can look at history and it could mean some serious things. I'm not fully certain, but it is what it is.
Angela, can I piggyback off of your pipeline question?
Yeah.
Sam, I've seen your podcast. I've also saw on Fulcrum Global the presentation about U.S., China, Russia, and so on. And on the Diplomat, there was an article on June 4th that talked about, instead of 2 against 1, it's now 1 against 1 plus 1. And they referred to many things you've already talked about here tonight. And that is that Biden, with the not putting the sanctions on the pipeline, is working to try to keep Russia a little bit on their side. And we may see more things along that line. And kind of my question is on this, probably there's more conflicts between Russia and China. I think the one unifying theme for those two countries is just the hatred and the wanting to put down the influence, Western influence in the United States. But my kind of question is, I guess, on this do you think the Biden administration is assessing China as a greater threat because of the economic power potentially that it is becoming, versus Russia is hurting us more psychologically? We're doing a good job of making fun of our own democracy and elections, but the real threat becomes where China may become the more influential power than Russia.
So I'm sorry, what was
well, my question is, do you think the Biden administration is assessing that China is the greater threat than Russia, and therefore we're willing to court them to try to limit China?
I think it is, but I know people who aren't happy about that too. I think you have people who are going to be a bit, because there have been, it's not just economics, but there are a lot of other complaints that people for years have been compiled up, and there are people who see it happen, but it's not addressed, but it may. But I think they understand, it's not just, it's both of them who are doing the influence because they have the capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
You have that, you're dealing with the reality where they both are masters of soft power. And one of the things that I've written on is about, US soft power is not the same as it was during the Cold War. And it combated whatever the Russians were throwing at us in terms of influence operations. And that's an issue we're dealing with. It's I think they do understand how big a threat China is, and I think the whole emphasis on competition is that reason why. But the thing is, and you have to, what's the thing the attitudes, one thing you have to understand is, you have a system of rules, and then there's, the system where people are not playing by the rules. And you have to look at it from that angle. And it's getting to the point, I think, where if you don't pay attention to that, it's going to be like, you can be the big power military and all that, but there's a really good article on, there's a publication called War on the Rocks, which is a big defense national security publication. And the guy pinpointed the concern that many analysts have had for years about the reality that if the US were to ever be in a near peer conflict, that they would be in bad shape to win it. And there's a lot of reasons to that. And I mean, it's not something a lot of people want to think about, but
I read that article, by the way.
Okay. Yeah. It was, I thought it was very important. So
I did too.
But it was, anyway, everyone should read it because there's, certain realities we have to deal with because we haven't been positioned to be dealing with near peer competitors for a long time. And I imagine the Biden administration is very concerned about that. I mean, they're probably trying to figure out, well, how are we going to maneuver and not, get into the next big, big conflict, or, there's.
I think we've got just a few minutes. I'd like to put a couple of the questions. We've got 3 questions left in the chat. I'd like to put 2 of them together and then ask the last one. So Alan adds, U.S. imports are greater now than they were 5 years ago. U.S. industry tends to have a short memory. Supply chain issues will be resolved by the end of 2021. As we get into 2022, the focus will be on profitability and foreign sourcing. And that'll become even more popular. I don't see many Americans wanting to pay more for something made in the US. Tariffs have just made US businesses less competitive globally and driven higher costs for US consumers. In the long term, what will drive the shift to more products sourced in the US? And then related, but not necessarily exactly the same topic, with the warming of the Arctic and the opening of the Northern Sea lanes, it will allow Russia to better compete commercially with China and its Belt and Road program. So you want to address the global supply chain and trade issues just briefly?
Yeah, well, it's something I'm following very heavily because I'm seeing it all over. And the problem is, we're dealing with a lot of the other scenarios. You're looking at inflation. You're looking at, oil prices are anticipated to go up even higher in early 2022. And a lot of that stuff does interrelate. And so, it's kind of like, when the Great Depression occurred in 1929, it actually was, they had a short recovery and they thought that was it. But 2 or 3 years later, their economy was in really bad shape. And I think one thing, you have to look at the past year, you've seen, one thing, when I started realizing that supplies were being limited, I was paying attention to what people were buying in the beginning of all this versus what they're buying now. And you still have the frivolous stuff, but it's lesser. And it could be for a lot of reasons. It could be there's just shortages. It could be that, there's a lot of preparation for a possible near peer conflict too. You can't take that out of the possibility, because the history of mobilization and economic reorientation, we've seen that in various periods. In fact, there's a very good book about that with World War II, Forge of Steel or something like that, I think. And it's and also actually the History Channel had a decent documentary about that. But I still question about the supply stuff. I still think there's, I think if things continue, I think you're going to see major changes. And the thing is, like if you look at like the semiconductor industry, they've been gradually trying to bring it here to the States. I think Trump started that, and then I think there's also a new attempt to get Taiwan to invest in Arizona. I think that was the other thing, I think. But in terms of, there's a lot of companies are trying to create new solutions to make up for shortage issues in terms of tech stuff, because that's going to be the big issue. People are still consuming tech, and it's when it comes to microchips and supplies, it's, you're dealing with the reality, like in terms of like mining for the resources. The PRC, they've bought up a lot of companies, and they own rights to a lot of areas, and they have a lot of it in their region too. But everything from the mining industry to shipbuilding, that's going to be something that will be a costly repurchase or upgrade for here, because we would have to really redevelop some of those industries if we bring it back here, or at least in our control realm, I guess you would say. It will take a lot of investment.
Okay. And not related, but an interesting tidbit. Robert Kapanji puts in, today the UK indicated plans to sail through Crimean waters again as Russia threatens to bomb on target. The reason is given that Britain never accepted the annexation of Crimea. It sounds ominous and conducive to belligerence. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it could be just sending a message or a signal saying that, well, if you're going to improve the security in the region for Ukraine or whoever, because you're seeing a lot of movement by NATO in that region. You're seeing exercises, but you're seeing increased troop strength, and I think you're seeing a lot of other movement. It could be related, I don't know, but I would say if they're seeing a lot of activity, they're just saying, maybe it could be saying, "Hi, how's it going?" But I think maybe they're sending a warning shot. Don't go too far here, but I think it's. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that it's do you or anyone else, do you think it's like is there any real meaning to it, or is it just part of the chess move?
Personally, I think go ahead, Bob.
Russia fired on the UK the first bolt.
Oh, they did already.
Yeah.
Oh boy, I didn't see that.
And then so that's kind of settled down for a couple of days, and then just today, the United Kingdom indicated that they are going to sail again through Crimean waters, and I think this is a direct confrontation to Russia, a challenge.
The UK says they didn't, Bob.
What, beg pardon?
Well, I was going to say, the UK says that the Russians didn't fire on them.
Oh.
They didn't.
No, they said Russia's making it up. I don't know who is what, but to me, it's a funny, I was reading the BBC this morning, and yeah, it's a crazy deal how they're each responding to, there was some kind of gunfire. We do know that.
From what I think I've heard is it wasn't They didn't like target directly at the ship, but like
Yeah.
somewhere nearby, and that was it. And,
Like a warning shot, you mean?
yeah.
So
Or
it does seem
they
that-
claim it was a test. Sorry.
Yeah, then it does seem like a chess move. It's like
Yeah.
the shipping vessels, U.S. shipping vessels using the South China Sea with U.S. military support, and and then the UK pushing back at Russia in the Black Sea. They don't own those seas, and I think the world's beginning to use their own chess moves to try to push back a little bit on the de facto Russian control of the Black Sea and de facto Chinese control of the South China Sea. But
U.S. is sailing through Taiwan again. So
yeah,
great.
the saber rattling starts again. So,
Yes, that's what Boris Johnson is doing. He's trying to teach the
well-
Russians a lesson. They don't own the seas.
yeah. Well, we have gone over, Sam, but you have given us a great deal to think about. The last question is, what's your best sources of information? Remember, where would you recommend people read to find out what they should know most?
Well, I look at a lot of different things, and also I have people who send me stuff who they do a lot of their own searches too, so we kind of share a lot of stuff. But I would say a service like Geopolitical Futures, that's a good place to start. Stratfor, I actually have subscriptions to both of them. But I also, I look at a lot of things, and the thing is, I look at a lot of different sources. Some of it is like great sources, but my philosophy is there's never really a perfect source. And you want to, it's about digesting information well, and it's kind of like a version of the Pareto 80-20 paradigm of digesting information, where I assume 80% is fluff, but 20% is, good, valuable, potent information, or at least stuff to think about and to explore for down the road. I think if you go to like YouTube, there's a really good channel called Caspian Report, and
I've seen that.
yeah, he has a lot of interesting analysis. He puts a lot of time into it too. But one thing I do is I read, but then I also put it in the back of my head, and if I want to explore it further at some point, I will. But I think War on the Rocks is a good publication, but it depends on what you want to get from that. I think it's different. The Diplomat is really good too. I've been following that for a long time. That's mainly for Asia, but in terms of other sources, I do a lot of different sources. I have to be honest, and some of it it's going to be more independent based, where you have to listen to these people to see what they're showing, and it depends on what you're looking for, I think. I look at a lot of different sources. I know we're going through a period where media is being questioned, but I think the best places to go to are the places where you get paid subscriptions, because they do put more emphasis, like the geopolitical groups.
I'll put a plug in for Stratfor. I've subscribed to Stratfor for a long time. I like that one too, but it's a subscription. So
yeah,
I
look at a lot of different areas. Every so often I'll look at a foreign affairs or a foreign policy, but I try to go for whoever provides the best amount of information and less spin.
Yeah.
And that's the key focus to look for. And you can find that in places, but you have to sometimes search for it. And sometimes, sometimes people I know, they do these action alerts. So, or these weekly briefings. I look at some of the stuff they share. One is, there's actually, I think, Red Team Society. It's a French entity. I think Red Team Society, I can't remember it, but it's the lady who runs it. I'm on her LinkedIn, so I'll be happy to send that.
Okay, if you send it, yeah, I'll send it out. I'll share it.
Sam, I found Al Jazeera English to be very interesting to go to.
Yeah, they have some good, yeah. I've
Yeah, because
read
the
some of their
reporters
stuff.
get into places that we don't normally hear about here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've used some of them. I've used, there's some Israeli sources that I look at too, if I'm
Mhm.
looking especially in that region. It's, I don't really have a particular, I have a few, the ones I mentioned, they're the ones I look at a lot, but I look a lot different. I'll go from one or the other. So.
Good.
If the think tanks do like an action report or, like you said, an analysis and not a policy issue, I have found most of them do a really good job. It's very interesting.
Yeah. I look at, CSIS is a good one. Hudson Institute is another. I actually did an internship at Hudson during my master's. So it's, that was an interesting experience because you get to see how they go through all this stuff and, it's a really, they're open to hearing a lot of ideas and collection of sources and to look at it. It was a really good experience.
U.S.
Before
Institute
we
of Peace
wrap
does
up-
an Iran primer.
Oh yeah. Before we wrap up, there's a couple of comments in the chat I'd like to direct you guys to about capacity, and Don made a recommendation about the concentration of certain key products, and Alan responded about supply and demand. So take a look at those just a little bit. We'll get back to normal. As Alan points out, it takes time. So we are we're at a close. So thank you, Sam. This has been really lively. You've given us a lot to think about. So tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, we have Pierre Morcos from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, the think tank Sam just mentioned. He will be talking about NATO. So join us at 11 a.m. tomorrow. Sam, hopefully you can, it's Central Time, so that would be,
12.
make the adjustment, but come join us. It should be a very lively discussion in the midst of all of the meetings the last couple of weeks, especially the meeting between Biden and Putin. That meeting with the NATO members kind of got overshadowed. But NATO 2030 is a big topic and will affect us in the United States and all of our partners very deeply, especially if countries like UK decide to start making interesting steps, we'll say. So with that, again, thank you, Sam. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Please stay safe. The weather is unpredictable, but we'll see you at 11 tomorrow. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Very well done.
Thank you.